So here we're going to go into the Israeli-Arab, and then we might say even Israeli-Palestinian conflict in a bit more detail, and then move on to the Iranian Revolution. So kind of two different kinds of developments that coming into the latter half of the 20th century really kind of defined developments in the Middle East. So we kind of left off with regards to Israel with its birth as a nation. You might remember that after the Second World War, tensions were escalating not just between Jews and Arabs, but also some of the more militant Zionists who really wanted to get the British out, kind of believing that now had come the time for the Jews to take their fate into their own hands. And just prior to that, the British kind of, already beginning to wash their hands of the whole affair, kind of recognizing that they were incapable of reconciling Jewish and Arab ambitions in Palestine, had turned over the problem to the United Nations. And this is a bit of a review. And in May of 1947, the UN appointed a special committee on Palestine known as UNISCOPE to try and come up with a solution. And intentionally, there were no great powers on this committee, kind of a feeling that none of the great powers at this point, including the United States and the Soviet Union, would be trusted by both parties. So the committee consisted of 11 states altogether, and what they came up with was a recommendation for partition to divide the state into two newly independent Arab and Jewish states, primarily based on demographics, right? Those areas that had sizable or even majority Jewish populations would be part of a future Jewish state. Other territories would be part of an Arab state. And Jerusalem would be under international administration, given its importance both to Jews and Arabs, but also to many of the great religions in the world. And so in the end, this partition plan was actually approved by the UN General Assembly on November 29th. The vote was 33-13 with 10 abstentions, and I think I mentioned this might be the first time and only time that the United States and the Soviet Union both voted on the same side. In this case, in favor of partition, and this ended up leading to UN General Resolution 181. The Zionists or Jewish community in Palestine voted in favor of the partition plan. The Palestinian Arabs didn't. I should note that there was kind of neither side really wanted the partition plan. On the Jewish side, they were quite sure that if it came to blows, that they would actually come out much better. But they also recognized that the Arab population would almost certainly reject the plan, so their decision to agree with it was primarily, I think, to create the appearance of being a more reasonable party. In any event, partition plan had to be agreed by both sides. Eventually, the British decided they'd had enough, and they left. And the day after, on May 15th, this was 1948, the newly independent state of Israel was declared, and almost immediately it found itself at war with its Arab neighbors, and we talked a bit about this in a previous lecture. At the time, it kind of had the appearance of a, David versus Goliath, Israel against the united might of the neighboring Arab states, but in actual fact, Israel was in pretty good shape militarily. In many ways also, the institutions of government had been laid down over the preceding 20 years. So as soon as the British left, they pretty much were up and running as a viable state. In any event, the war went on for about 1 year. From the Israeli point of view, they called it the War of Independence. A more neutral term might be the Arab-Israeli War of 1948-1949. But when the dust finally settled, the newly created Israeli state was actually considerably larger than what the partition plan had called for. So what you see roughly in blue there. The only territories in Palestine that didn't end up part of Israel were the quote-unquote West Bank, i.e. West Bank of the Jordan River. That was incorporated into Jordan, and that's that kind of white section in the center there. and also a strip around the city of Gaza that is actually not indicated on the map, and that was incorporated into Egypt, i.e. the Gaza Strip. And Jerusalem ended up a divided city with the western half under Israeli control and the eastern half under Jordanian control. Now, one immediate consequence of the war was the creation of a large Palestinian refugee population. So when the Arab states attacked Israel, they had actually called upon Palestinians to pretty much get out of the way. We should note, though, that the Israeli army also tried very hard to compel Palestinians to evacuate large areas that would become part of the Israeli state. In one case, by massacring a large part of the population of a town called Deir Yassin. And once word of that spread, and so kind of the rumor went about that the Israeli army intended the same for every village they came into, well, you can imagine the outcome. In any event, large numbers of Palestinian refugees were created, and almost immediately they were kind of put under the authority of a UN-created institution, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, UNRWA, which is still around today. So it was established to provide relief and works programs for Palestine refugees, and so almost immediately establishing refugee camps. Many of them are in the West Bank, so initially we're talking about Palestinian refugees coming from Israel proper, but some of them would end up in other Arab countries as well. And the one problem with this, in a sense, is that it kind of, you still have large numbers of Palestinian refugees, even going down several generations, who still dream of returning to their homes, right? So these Palestinians are never going to be settled in any of the neighboring Arab states. And so when you talk about some kind of resolution to the still ongoing Israeli-Palestinian conflict, a big issue that has to be addressed is what to do about Palestinian refugees, right? So, but there really was no choice at the time. And in fairness to the neighboring Arab states, there was always kind of a feeling that, if they were to take in all of these refugees, in a sense, this would legitimize the state of Israel, which at that point they were not prepared to do. And most Palestinians did not want to become citizens of other Arab states. They really dreamed of returning to their homes. Having said that, we should note that about a fairly large number of Palestinian Arabs are going to remain in this newly created Israeli state, such that today about 20% of Israeli citizens are not Jewish. They're actually Arab. Israel prefers to call them Israeli Arabs, but they self-identify as Palestinians. So they are citizens of Israel, they have voting rights and so forth. In theory, they have equal rights as any Jewish Israeli, but in actual practice, very often treated as secondary citizens. So for instance, they can run for parliament, they can vote. You do have Arabs that are actually sent to the Israeli parliament, but no Israeli government would ever actually make a coalition with Arab parties, right? That would inherently be seen as illegitimate by the large number of Israeli Jews. But if you think about it, that means they can't really have a meaningful role in kind of determining Israeli policy and so forth. Almost immediately, Israel is going to issue the law of return, right? So one of the primary goals of the Israeli state is to try and encourage as many Jews to come to Israel as possible, primarily in order to ensure a Jewish majority. But in any event, right, the law of return basically indicates that anyone of Jewish descent has the right to automatic citizenship in Israel. So for instance, my mother is Jewish. If I wanted to tomorrow, I could just decide to immigrate to Israel, and I would be given immediate citizenship. I'd probably also be given various kinds of assistance to get me set up. So this is initiated in July of 1950 by the Knesset, which is the term used for the Israeli parliament. And almost immediately, they're going to really encourage, in particular, Jews in the various Arab countries to immigrate to Israel. Many of whom are not Zionists, but in part because of the Israeli-Arab conflict, are beginning to find it very uncomfortable to remain in Arab states, right? It has kind of a polarizing effect. And so many ultimately are compelled to relocate to Israel. You're going to see large numbers of Jews coming from countries like Egypt, Iraq, Iran, also Yemen is going to see large numbers of Jews, and also Morocco. Morocco is one country where actually a fair number of Jews are going to remain. And again, I cannot stress enough, many of them are not Zionists. It's just that they find their situation uncomfortable at some point and decide, or are in some fashion compelled to relocate to Israel, where very often they're treated as secondary, kind of second-class citizens, right, of kind of secondary status. Most Jews up until this point had come from Europe, tended to be kind of rooted in European culture, and tend to take a rather kind of negative view of Jews coming from the Arab states, who they see as being culturally too Arab. I mean, and in fact, they are culturally Arab, but they're made to feel as if somehow that makes them inferior. In some cases, the Israeli state is going to be very active in bringing Jews to Israel. A good example of that is Operation Magic Carpet, which takes place in 1949-1950, that brings about 49,000 Jews from Yemen to the new state of Israel. So you might remember, coming into the 1950s, we have someone we might call the new sheriff in the Arab world, Gamal Abdel Nasser, who had been part of the Free Officers movement that had initiated a military coup seizing power in Egypt in July of 1952. And very quickly he emerged as the leading figure of that group, the leading political figure in Egypt, where he became president, but also the leading voice of pan-Arabism, right? This movement that sought to unite the Arab states throughout the Middle East and to empower them. And one very important part of their agenda was to somehow liberate Palestine on behalf of their Palestinian brethren. And you might remember he really came to the fore when he nationalized the Suez Canal in 1956 to raise revenue for the Aswan Dam. Right? From that point forward, he's very often going to be speaking on behalf of all Arabs, including Palestinians, and very often actively seeking to assist Palestinian Arabs in whatever way he can to eventually reclaim their homeland. And from a pretty early point, you have Palestinians operating from territory that remained under their control, either in the Gaza Strip, as you can see in this map, or in the West Bank, who were engaging in militant attacks or guerrilla attacks against Israel. From an Israeli point of view, terrorist attacks, right? They refer to themselves as fedayeen, meaning those ready to sacrifice their life. And again, they generally operated from bases in the territory surrounding Israel, particularly those that were predominantly Palestinian, again, like the West Bank, which is under Egyptian control, under Jordanian control, or the Gaza Strip that's under Egyptian control, sometimes also from Lebanon. So, you know, basically they would just kind of jump across the border, initiate attack, and then run back to, you know, across the border to where they would be safe. And many of these fedayeen were being trained and equipped by Egyptian intelligence. So as you might imagine, Israel took a very dismal view of this, and, you know, kind of feeling that Egypt is assisting these fedayeen in launching attacks on Israeli territory. Very often Israel would then retaliate with disproportionate military strikes, not just against the Palestinian operatives, their bases, but also against the host countries, right? The idea that this might discourage them from allowing the fedayeen to operate on their territory. And this is one of the reasons why Israel is going to be involved in the Suez crisis, right? This attack orchestrated by the British in collaboration with the British and Israelis, known as Operation Musketeer. And you might remember it was kind of a secret plan, right? I mean, it was very transparent. Everyone understood pretty quickly what had happened. But the basic idea is that Israel would launch an attack across the Sinai Peninsula towards the Suez Canal. And as they came very close, the British and French would call upon both Israeli and Egyptian soldiers to move back from the Suez Canal zone, supposedly in an effort to separate the two belligerent parties. But this was all kind of pre-orchestrated, knowing that the Egyptians would say no, and this would provide a pretext for the British and French to occupy the Suez Canal zone. And militarily, it went off without a hitch, right? So Operation Musketeer began on October 31st with a bombing campaign. And then after the Egyptians refused to move back from the canal zone, the British and French basically parachuted troops into the zone and took it over, right? And here you see an image of British Marines raising the flag over Port Said, the major town on the Suez Canal. And one outcome of this was Israel had gained control of Sinai. But you might recall when we talked about the Suez Crisis previously, the United States in particular was very unhappy with this and put pressure on all parties involved to evacuate, right? So the British and French had to relinquish control of the Suez Canal zone. This turned out to be very humiliating for the British Prime Minister, Anthony Eden, who had to resign. And the Israelis were forced. So Israel was forced to relinquish the Sinai. And pretty much right after that, so I mean, tensions are pretty high. United Nations now gets involved, and this is the first time this actually ever happened. They sent a kind of peacekeeping force to act as a buffer zone, keeping the Israelis and Egyptians separate, and they're going to occupy the Sinai along the border with Israel. Technically known as an emergency force. Sometimes the slang is blue helmets. So again, the first force of its kind deployed in this way. But it does kind of help to ease tensions a bit, at least for the time being. But that's going to prove short-lived. So the next conflict is going to be the Six-Day War in 1967. And when historians try to, think about like, well, what brought that conflict about, it's kind of a sequence of incidences that are going to escalate tensions between Israel and the neighboring Arab states. And one incident, maybe a good starting point for this, considering this chain of events, is what's known as the Samu incident. And so you remember, you have these Palestinian Arab militants known as Fedayeen who are launching attacks over the border, in some cases from the West Bank. And at one point, Israel decides to take a much harder line in its response after an attack from the town of Isamu in the West Bank. An Israeli military operation launches on November 13th, 1966, where the Israeli army, the Israeli Defense Forces, enter the West Bank town of Isamu in response to this militant attack. And this is going to kind of, in some ways, set off a chain of events as tensions begin to escalate, eventually leading to the Six-Day War of 1967. We should note that by this point, Jordan is under a new ruler. We had kind of left Jordan under the authority of Abdullah. Abdullah had been the brother of Faisal, the son of the Sharif Hussein of the Hussein-McMahon correspondence. And he was assassinated, and almost immediately he was succeeded by his son Talal in 1952. But he proved actually to be mentally unfit, and almost immediately after that was replaced by the grandson. And so the grandson, who's simply referred to as King Hussein, is going to rule until his death in 1999. He proves to be a very effective ruler, by the way. Jordan, if you remember, kind of created as an artificial state, and not many people thought that it would actually survive. And as it turns out, it's one of the more successful states in the region, in no small measure because of the effective rule of King Hussein. But in any event, it isn't Hussein who's going to initiate a response to Israel. It's going to be Syria, who at this point controls an area known as the Golan Heights. And as you can see from the diagram in the bottom left-hand corner, it's called that because it's at a very elevated position right on the border with Israel at this point, and thus providing a very good vantage point for firing upon Israel, which they subsequently do. And so that, of course, is going to raise tensions even further. But probably the point of no return might be when Egypt remilitarizes Sinai. And the problem is, by this point, Nasser has become, in some ways, a victim of his own success, right? I mean, he's under tremendous pressure as the leading voice of Pan-Arabism and the Palestinian cause being kind of the preeminent Arab cause, to actually do something at this point. And in May 1967, Nasser instructs UN troops who are kind of, acting as a buffer in Sinai to leave with the purpose of remilitarizing the peninsula. That means that Israel now has Egyptian troops right on its border, inclusive of tanks, right? They're massing on the Israeli border. Now, most historians feel that Nasser really didn't want to go to war. And one indication of this is that a good part of the Egyptian army at this point was kind of bogged down in a civil war in Yemen, again on behalf of the cause of Pan-Arabism. But in any event, in fairness to Israel, once Egypt remilitarizes Sinai, that really does put Israel under tremendous pressure, right? I mean, it does start to look as if war is imminent. The problem for Israel is they really cannot afford to get bogged down in a long war, particularly if it involved all of the neighboring Arab states who, in the interim since the last time they fought Israel, had really built up their militaries, right? So they would have been more effective. The problem for Israel is twofold, right? On the one hand, it's a very narrow country, and particularly when Jordan controlled the West Bank, you actually have parts of Jordanian territory that come within 10 miles of the Mediterranean. So if the Arab states were to attack Israel, the first thing they would probably do, and this would make sense militarily, is to sever Israel into half, right? To really kind of, attack at that very weak point and just plow your way to the Mediterranean and basically sever Israel into a northern and southern component. The second problem is the Israeli population is not particularly large. So some of you might know that Israelis are required to do military service, right? It's not a volunteer army. Everyone is drafted, including women, right? But mostly it's only men who are sent to the front lines. And when a male Israeli is finished with their military service, they are in the reserves for a very extended period of time, the idea that they're going to be called up in the event of war. And so that means when war does come, most of the male population is going to be involved in the fighting, bringing the Israeli economy to a virtual standstill. So, again, if a war went on for a long time, it would take a really heavy toll on Israel. So if it seems that war is imminent, Israel is in some ways under pressure to engage in what we call a preemptive attack. Now, Israel has one other particular issue with Egypt that also could be considered a provocation to war. And that is when, on May 23rd, Nasser initiates a naval blockade of the Straits of Tiran, basically the entry point to the Red Sea, which means that shipping cannot reach the Israeli port of Eilat. And at this time, that is by far the major port for Israel. Later on, Tel Aviv will become much more important in that way. But that means that in this regard, Israel becomes very vulnerable if they get forced into a long war, and then their port of entry is being blocked. This would be a very, very severe issue. And then on top of that, at some point, we start to find Jordanian troops massing on the border, under Egyptian command, by the way. And I should note that King Hussein did not want to get involved in a war with Israel. Very often keeping, this is kind of like standard for the Jordanian government, whoever was the ruler, keeping kind of backdoor channels open with Israel. The role of Jordan has often been trying to be that of a mediator between the Arab states, Palestinians on the one side, and Israelis on the other. But at some point, Nasser actually almost effectively kidnaps King Hussein, has him flown to Cairo, and basically forced to sign kind of military alliance agreement with Egypt. And so that's why we find Jordanian troops beginning to mass on the border. And of course, again, remember that if the Arab states attack Israel, probably the first thing they want to do is sever Israel in half. And they could do that within half an hour, right? So Israel is actually the country that initiates the Six-Day War. But again, in fairness, at this point, it did seem that war was imminent. All indications are that Israel didn't particularly want to go to war, but they really felt compelled at this point to do so. And so they're going to launch an attack against Egypt, Syria, and Jordan all at the same time. And the reason it's called the Six-Day War is because it is a very, very short war, and that works to Israel's advantage. So the first thing Israel does is they basically destroy the entire Egyptian Air Force while it's on the ground. And that's pretty much game over from that point. By the way, we see in the bottom left-hand corner, that is actually King Hussein signing the agreement for a military alliance. And on the right side, and that kind of gives you an idea about the outcome. This is going to be a tremendous victory for Israel in terms of conquered territory, including all of Jerusalem. What we see there are Israeli soldiers standing in front of the Western Wall, or Wailing Wall, right, of the former temple, the perimeter wall around the Haram al-Sharif, which up until between 48 and 67 they had no access to. Right? This is actually, like, in Israel, it's like a very famous photo. The consequences of the Six-Day War, the conflict is going to see the creation of 300,000 additional Palestinian refugees, largely in connection with the fact that Israel is going to conquer a tremendous amount of territory. When the dust settles, Israel has occupied all of the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, also taken the Golan Heights from Syria, meaning now that they have the high point, or the, that advantage if there should ever be a conflict with Syria, where they can rain down gunfire and tank fire onto Syrian territory, and all of the Sinai Peninsula. So that means at this point, considering the refugees that had already been created, you have a tremendous number of Palestinian refugees that are going to have to be dealt with down the road. On top of that, you have now about 1.5 million Arabs under Israeli control. Some of them Israeli citizens, but also many of these refugees who are now who are in the West Bank, who had been forced to vacate their homes in 48, 49. And this, in some ways, is going to create another problem. The temptation to keep these territories and even to settle them. And so this temptation is right there from the beginning. Now, part of it reflects the fact that if you're looking at the biblical history of the Jewish people, many of the locations in Palestine corresponding to events in the Bible are actually located in the West Bank, right? And from a pretty early point, in fact, Israelis begin to refer to the West Bank as Judea and Samaria, which are the biblical names. That kind of gives you a sense of the Israeli perspective regarding them. So you're going to start to see large numbers of Israeli settlements built there. Initially, it's not a tremendous number, but it's going to very quickly start to go up in number. In the meantime, though, you still have large numbers of Palestinian Arabs who basically are stateless now, right? They're not made Israeli citizens. They're living under Israeli military occupation, in effect, and those numbers are going to grow as well. So, as of 2006, and so you might imagine the number is quite a bit larger now. According to the Palestinian Central Bureau of Statistics, you have about 2.5 billion Palestinians living in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. Palestinians in East Jerusalem are, in fact, offered Israeli citizenship, but they decline. Right? So imagine that. You have 2.5 million Palestinian Arabs living under Israeli authority, but who have no rights as citizens whatsoever. The Gaza Strip, in some ways, not much better. That is the narrow strip of land on the Mediterranean around the city of Gaza. And currently you have about 1.4 million residents, all Palestinian, living there as well. And this is a very small area, right? So that's a large number of people for a territory that is about 140 square miles in size. It's often cited as being the most densely populated place on Earth. The problem ultimately, though, is going to be that as you start to increase the number of Jewish Israeli settlements, particularly in the West Bank. There are some in Gaza, but the West Bank is where most of them are concentrated. Right? And this map gives you kind of an idea of where things stand, even already a bit outdated, around 2010. So I mean, they're just kind of, pretty much scattered throughout. And very often they tend to be located on high points, as you can see in these images here, looking down upon Palestinian villages which tend to be more often located in valleys. So first of all, there's this kind of feeling, if you're a Palestinian, of being surrounded by Israeli settlements that are looking down upon you. Second of all, that you're competing with resources, most of which are being diverted to these settlements, including water. And third of all, the Israeli government, through its military, will ensure that these settlements are secure. So very often, they'll very often have access roads to Israel proper that Palestinian Arabs are not permitted to use. Very often they have to take very roundabout ways to get from one Palestinian village to another in order to somehow work their way around these access roads or around settlements and so forth. So this is going to become a major problem, particularly given that almost immediately after the war in '67, the Six-Day War, the solution that the UN comes up with for resolving the conflict basically would require Israel to give up these occupied territories. Right? This is UN Security Council Resolution 242. It has basically two main components. On the one hand, it calls for the withdrawal of Israeli armed forces from territories occupied in the recent conflict. On the second hand, in return, Israel would receive recognition, would be designated legitimate by the Arab states, in line with the right of every state in the area to live in peace within secure and recognized boundaries, free from threats and acts of force. I do want to point out one thing. The language refers to territories, not the territories. The point being that in theory, Israel does not have to withdraw from all of the occupied territories. They might withdraw from just some of them. Initially, though, the idea is that they would withdraw from the vast majority of the West Bank and Gaza. There might be a little bit of territory swapping, maybe to kind of, that really narrow point in Israel where the West Bank comes close to the Mediterranean might be widened a bit. But as you start to see more and more Israeli settlements built in the West Bank and pretty much all over the place, that really is going to make it difficult to imagine what an Israeli withdrawal would look like. First of all, if you're a Palestinian, you're becoming skeptical that there's any intention to withdraw, because then why are you building settlements? Secondly, even if the Israeli government decided to withdraw, there would be tremendous resistance from the Jewish settlers in these settlements. And I keep saying Jewish settlers because I want to be clear. Only Jews are permitted to reside there. Even Israeli citizens who are Arab are not wanted in these settlements. Now, some of the settlers are just, individuals who, very often they're offered subsidies if they choose to live in the settlement, get a bigger house, maybe a swimming pool and so forth. But many of them are increasingly religious zealots, right? Individuals who are residing there because they feel God has given the Jews this land and they must not give it up at any cost. And many of them have made it quite clear they'd be quite willing to go against the Israeli government if they ever decided to give up territory for peace. Well, the Six-Day War was a complete humiliation for Nasser for the cause of Pan-Arabism. I think we talked about this. Nasser actually offered to resign, to step down, but the Egyptian people came out into the streets and begged him to stay in office. But he's really a broken man after this and dies of a stroke in 1970. From the Palestinian point of view, there really was this kind of feeling that we've got to take matters into our own hands from this point forward. So there was an organization representing the Palestinians already in existence, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, PLO, in Arabic, Munazamat al-Tahrir al-Filistiniya. It's actually an umbrella organization representing a number of different paramilitary groups, all fighting against Israel. Now, it was created in 1964 by the Arab League, kind of an organization representing the different Arab states. But initially, it was really kind of under their control, meaning under Egyptian control. But after the Six-Day War, it's going to increasingly operate independently. It had been created as, supposedly to, since Palestinians didn't have a state, it would represent them in that capacity, the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. But again, until 1967, they pretty much stood on the sidelines, allowing the Arab states to deal with Israel. After the Six-Day War, they were going to become much more militantly active. And from a pretty early point, they come under the leadership of a fellow named Yasser Arafat, the head of one of the more important paramilitary groups known as Fatah in the PLO. And eventually he becomes chairman of the PLO, that's in 1969, a position he will hold until his death in 2004. Part of the reason he ended up in this leadership position and why the PLO also became much more important was shortly after the Six-Day War, they got involved in literally in a kind of militant conflict with the Israeli Defense Forces at the town of Karama in Jordan, where they actually proved capable of holding their own. I mean, it wasn't that they, brought about a major military defeat for Israel, but they definitely didn't humiliate themselves, right? And so this provided a lot of encouragement for Palestinian Arabs, many of whom, so Arafat had actually been part of that battle and had performed very admirably, and that kind of catapulted him to the leadership position. But that battle also encouraged many Palestinian Arabs to flock to the cause, to join the PLO, and they're definitely going to become a major thorn in the side of Israel from that point forward. Meanwhile, in Egypt, after 1970, we have a new president, a fellow named Mohammed Anwar al-Sadat, or we very often just say Sadat. He had actually been one of the free officers, but had always kept a very low profile until this, and he now becomes president of Egypt. In 1970, a position he will hold until his assassination in 1981. And the reason he's assassinated is because it's under his leadership that Egypt will become the first Arab country to make peace with Israel, something that upsets quite a few people, including one member of the Egyptian Islamic Jihad, who is responsible for his death. But that doesn't happen right away. In the meantime, in Israel, a new political party has emerged, known as the Likud Party. And the Likud Party, in fact, it is now the dominant party in Israel. They're much more right-wing than what till then had been the dominant party, the Labour Party. They make it clear that they have no desire to give up any of the territory that was conquered in the Six-Day War. In fact, they call for the annexation and settlement of the West Bank and Gaza and the Golan Heights, all of which they consider to be rightfully, the term often used is Eretz Yisrael, land of Israel. Initially, they even want to hold on to the Sinai, but they're maybe not as ideologically committed to that. And this party does pretty well, in particular with many of the Jews that came from the Arab states who had always felt disenfranchised by the Labour Party, who were not really committed to this much more secular vision of Zionism, tended to be much more conservative, and for whom religion was a much more important part of their identity as Jews and now Israelis. So the Likud Party becoming much more strong. Alongside of that, this is actually kind of before this happens, right? But at some point, Israel also becoming very, very cocky, almost to the point of arrogance in their dealing with the Arab states, right? I mean, their victory in the Six-Day War was so decisive that many Israelis have become convinced that they don't even really need to give up anything for peace with the Arab states. The Arab states would never dare to attack them. Eventually, they will be compelled to make peace with Israel just because of Israeli strength. And so Sadat becomes very frustrated with that. And at some point he realizes that the only way he's actually like looking to negotiate with Israel, but Israel is not willing to sit down at the table. And he is convinced that the only way he can change Israeli behavior in that regard is by starting another war, right? To kind of shake things up. And that will be the Yom Kippur War, sometimes called the October War, sometimes the 1973 Arab-Israeli War, sometimes the Ramadan War. It takes place both on Yom Kippur, one of the holiest days for Jews, a day of fasting and of great sorrow and repentance, but also during Ramadan. There's a lot of discussion about why it happened in Yom Kippur, I mean, whether the intention was to take Israelis at unawares, though there's been some argument that that was more coincidental. In any event, it was a complete surprise to Israel when they were attacked by a coalition of Arab nations led by Egypt and Syria. And if they were taken unawares, certainly the fact that it was on Yom Kippur, when many soldiers were home to go to synagogue and to fast with their families, but that wasn't the only reason. Israel had really become convinced that this just couldn't happen. So it began with a surprise joint attack by Egypt and Syria. And what's really interesting is it was even more successful than Sadat anticipated. And there actually, at some point, was the possibility that Israel might not survive. One of the things that saved Israel is that the war wasn't started to destroy Israel. And the Egyptian army, for instance, had advanced so rapidly that at some point the Egyptian military commander didn't know what to do. He's like, am I supposed to take Tel Aviv? It's there, ready for the taking. And that kind of held things up. And then eventually the United States is going to start airlifting military equipment to Israel because at some point the United States becomes concerned that Israel might not make it. And by the way, the United States was not as major a supporter of Israel at this point as it would become. And so in the end, Israel was able to repel the attack. And from a strictly military point of view, you might even say that Israel came out on top. I mean, they came within 50 kilometers of Cairo, but also their intention was not to take over Egypt or its capital. But this did, militarily, you could argue Israel won, but the war did achieve what Sadat wanted, which is it finally compelled Israel to sit down at the table and negotiate, with a bit of prodding from the United States. Said negotiations wouldn't happen immediately. There was still some resistance in Israel. One very decisive factor is when Sadat at some point flew to the Israeli capital of Jerusalem. I should say unrecognized capital. At this point, no country, I think maybe El Salvador, maybe not yet, recognized Jerusalem as the capital. So here's Sadat flying there. He goes to the Israeli parliament, the Knesset, and basically speaking before them says that Egypt wants peace. And this actually is going to move a large number of Israelis emotionally, making them much more receptive to the idea. And then eventually it's under a Likud government that Israel will finally negotiate with Egypt. And so the negotiations will take place at the U.S. presidential retreat of Camp David, headed up to the two negotiating teams headed up by Anwar Sadat and the Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin, under the watchful eye of the American president at the time, Jimmy Carter, who's going to work very hard to try and help get the two parties to arrive at an agreement. Negotiations begin in September of 1978. And within a relatively short period of time, they do finally arrive at two agreements, in fact. The first agreement calling for a framework for negotiations, right? So kind of like creating a foundation for negotiations to establish an autonomous self-governing authority in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, right? A first step towards resolving the Palestinian issue. This agreement, though, almost immediately falling to the wayside. The second agreement will actually stick, right? So this becomes the basis for a peace treaty between Israel and Egypt. Basically, Israel giving up Sinai, returning it to Egypt in return for normal diplomatic relations with that country. So that part of the negotiations will actually be followed through. But as you might imagine, many Arabs, certainly many Palestinian Arabs, felt betrayed. Right? They basically felt Egypt had made peace, but unacceptably because they did not even move forward, never mind resolve the Palestinian situation. Right? And that ends up being the basis for why Sadat is assassinated. And this is actually going to, Egypt up until now had been the leader of Pan-Arabism, had been the leader of the Arab world. They will now be greatly marginalized and to some degree ostracized by the other Arab states. And it will be several decades before they're able to enter the fold of the Arab states, shall we say. So this is a good place to stop. We'll pick up the second half of this lecture, kind of continuing with some developments related to Israel and neighboring Arab states, and also related to some developments in those states themselves, and then turn to the Iranian Revolution.